This is day 2 of the June 91 7-day retreat at Springwater. Most of the talks during a retreat take off from questions that have been asked in private meetings and in group meetings. They are put so that the person who asked them, at least in the private meetings, remains anonymous. If you ever ask a question that you wish not to be brought up in a talk, then please let me know, and it won't be. These questions are not written down verbatim. It's impossible for me to do this. I write them down whenever I have some time after, or quite a while after a meeting. And at that moment, maybe only the essence of the question is left, not the precise way in which it was put. If you would like a question put precisely the way you asked it, then would you please give it to me in writing? Also, it does happen that several people ask very similar questions during certain times, and not every single one is written down, sort of a new version is noted down. This way of giving talks does not mean that there's a burden on you to provide me with questions. Sometimes people say, I don't have any interesting question for you. Please don't be concerned over this, and do not avoid meetings because you feel you have no interesting question. We don't need any questions to meet. Also recently, during recent talks, I have, instead of just picking a few that I thought to use, I've read whatever I've noted down between talks. And people have found that helpful, to hear what other people ask. But not all the questions will be discussed. Sometimes I've left one out that somebody felt, why don't you discuss this? Then let me know, and maybe it'll come up the next time. I can see the same pattern coming up in me time and time again. I look at the problems or patterns, I see them, but nothing changes. Does it take a leap to get out of this level? What is the worth of falling into inattention time and time again? This falling into inattention time and time again, is this also determined neurochemically? The constant occupation with oneself, is that an addiction? In order to do this work, does one have to take out a certain period of time? Say 5 years, to pursue this work consistently, seriously, so one doesn't constantly get sucked into old patterns. A close relationship has just ended for me, like many times before in my life. I'm surprised at the intensity with which, during sitting, the fear of being abandoned is coming up. And I find myself wondering whether getting married would help with the fear of abandonment. Some spiritual traditions recommend meditating on our own death. What do you think about that? Can we help another? Why is it so enormously difficult to stay with this moment? Can one do this work alone without any guidance? I feel very depressed just about almost everything. I feel hopeless about all my desires and pursuits. What do I do about all the sad, horrible things that happen in the world to human beings? Things that we do to each other, the pain we cause each other, the injustices. What do I do about all that? Maybe on a cosmic scale it doesn't matter whether one kills or hurts another or helps another. We don't know. Actually, the question that cropped up most frequently this past day was, why is it so difficult, almost impossible, to stay with this moment? Finding oneself inattentive most of the time on thought trains, emotional trains, calculating trains, projecting, remembering, anticipating trains of thought, almost all the time. Why is that so? Why this? And on these trains, noticing self-concern as the central theme. What happened to me, what is happening to me, what will happen to me. Maybe also concern what is happening to other people. And yet, what can I do about it? How can I help? What is my relationship to that? What is inattention? What is attention? Staying in this moment, being there, being here, awake, wide awake, may happen for a moment. It happens to all of us, not just during retreat. Maybe at a moment of crisis, an accident happening, an emergency taking place, and the mind is attentive and the body is there to do whatever needs to be done, or to hold still if that's what needs to be done. Because the mind is not occupied with this other, thinking about oneself, randomly or directively about the past, present, and future. But then, if the crisis abates, the emergency is over, the thought picks up, maybe first about the crisis, what could have happened to me, these thoughts not being there during a moment of crisis, because the mind is awake and alert and therefore intelligent, acting, seeing things that need to be done, and seeing what is irrelevant and not entering into that. That's also usually a great deal of energy in a crisis. There seems to be some linkage between energy there and attention to see what is happening, and not just to see what action has to be taken, but the attention is already action. Seeing what is there is action. It is not a reactive thinking about comes out of program laid down in the past, even as if it was the past 5 minutes. All of our thinking and ideas and acting out of that is reaction. Out of what I think I should do or ought to be doing, what others are doing, trying to imitate or follow. All of that is reactive. It doesn't come out of seeing this moment, which is action. So one has come here, or is finding oneself here, sitting or walking, and there is all the intention in the world to be attentive, to be in this moment, partly because the old program is sort of running quietly or noisily. You ought to be attentive while you're here. That's what you paid your money for, made the time for. Other people are doing it. This is what they do here. That's what I should be doing. Can one already discover such programs running, hear them, and question them? By questioning, meaning not taking what comes so habitually through the body and mind for the truth. Not following habitually our habitual programs of do this, don't do that. Be like this, don't be like that. But to notice it, become aware of it in a maybe very subtle way. Some of these instructions and commands are very subtle, and therefore can the listening also be subtle. And then wondering about it, coming upon it, and like one comes upon something one has never seen before. A new insect, a new flowering grass, a new instruction one hasn't heard before. One may have heard, we always think we should be doing this or that. One has thought about that and remembers having read it. But it's quite a different thing to actually perceive this internal instruction. Be attentive. Don't be inattentive. The instruction, be attentive, is not attention, but hearing that instruction is attention. Thinking I ought to be attentive, and then what usually happens in our conditioned ways, sort of getting into an attentive stance, as it were, performing attention, or doing attention, like one person has called it. I have such a hard time doing attention. It's almost impossible for me to do it. One person said to do attention. And if one lives by these commands that are programmed internally, one may start to open or close a door quietly, or put on a jacket very quietly, but not notice what's going on around one. Not notice the image that is there inside, of being the attentive one, the attentive door opener, the attentive jacket dresser. To to watch to see the power of this image. And there's a limited attention in carefully putting on a jacket, but does one also see the image that one is conforming to, that gives pleasure of doing something well? Or the other side of the same coin, feeling down on oneself because one labels oneself inattentive. Not that there aren't long periods of time of inattention, but one doesn't need to label oneself being either attentive or inattentive. That's already more inattention, more beside the point, habitual stuff. Becoming something, being something, and thinking about ourselves in certain ways which affect us deeply, profoundly, organismically. We think we're good in the presence of a situation which we think demands attention. If we think we're good, we're doing it well, it's the same as being good for the teacher or being good for mom and dad, the good boy or girl. And the habitual good feelings that accrue from such thoughts, which indeed are neurochemically transmitted. And there's no doubt about this. A thought of being good and elicits good feelings. And what are good feelings? Other than some of the 30,000 chemicals of this body in action, stimulating organs, breathing, musculature, glands, with further effects. And likewise feeling down on oneself, hopeless, helpless. And the thoughts about it have a chemically, neurologically, whatever you want to call it, depressive effect on this whole organism. So then the question, why is it so difficult to be attentive, to be with this moment as it is? Where is the question coming from? Can we scoop deeply? Does it come from having noticed time and time and time again, maybe for the millionth time, that the mind was caught up in a network of thoughts about oneself and wondering, why does this happen? Sort of as though one was scientifically interested in this. And by scientific, I just mean not, one is interested in something that is happening in this world, in oneself, in this universe which is oneself, which one is interested to find out more about. Not to write a thesis about it. That may be one's motivation, and that motivation usually gives a lot of energy to explore, because one is about to write a book which may get one a degree, acknowledgement, and so forth. That's one motive for observing oneself. Maybe. I'm not saying anybody here is writing theses about it. But is one interested in this phenomenon of attention and inattention because one has found out for oneself deeply all the effects of inattention, of self-concern, the isolation, the adversity that is created between us in being absorbed in a self-concerned space, the walls that it creates around ourselves and makes it impossible to meet each other. This phenomenon of creating images about oneself and each other, how it bars us from really being in touch with what we are from moment to moment, and the tragedy of not being in touch with each other as we are, but basing our relationship, our responses to each other on what we remember a person was yesterday or 10 years ago, maybe 30 years ago. All of this image making and carrying of memories being the very stuff of inattention. Out of understanding the sorrow that we create for each other and ourselves in not being open and free and unburdened with each other, unburdened by history, by labels, racial labels, religious labels, national labels, tribal labels, political labels, labels about our ways of relating to each other sexually. The sorrow we create for each other by not being able to see a human being as he, she is, freely, unobstructedly, creates sorrow, misery for each other endlessly, in personal animosity, conflicts, and in global animosity, conflict, war. So is the question coming out of this deep concern about what we're doing to ourselves and each other, when there is no freedom from all the accumulated, remembered, habitual, addictive thought processes, that one comes in very intimate touch when one is on a silent retreat, and really wondering, not with despair or with anger at oneself or resignation, but scientifically, openly, freely. Why is this so? What brings this about? Is it possible that this not continue forever? That it change in this moment? Wondering, not placing a condition upon oneself. I have to find this out in order to become a better person, an attentive person. We touched upon that earlier. But finding out about things that are actually happening. Not blindly accepting or running on programs that maybe, if seen, if detected, if brought to light, don't need to continue, at least for that moment of seeing. And maybe for longer periods, one does not know. So this question has come up with so many people we talked together. Why is it so difficult? Why does it happen at all? A moment of attention, a moment of hearing clearly, without all the verbiage and reaction and for or against, like, dislike, and then immediately gone. And the fact that it's gone isn't noticed, because that's the very character of inattention, is that one is not aware. There's no awareness, or maybe just a partial flickering of it. But then comes a moment of awareness again, because one wouldn't be able to talk about being so inattentive if there wasn't also awareness of inattention. It does happen, and it happens more frequently in a silent gathering or retreating. So at that moment of coming to, waking up as it were, can there just be nothing other than what is? Not the mind immediately evaluating this moment, evaluating what is noticed about the past that is still reverberating, the inattention, the self-concern, self-absorption. Not evaluating it, not reacting to it. Just there, not knowing what to think about it. Because very often the inattention starts with evaluation of what was noticed during that instant of attention. A moment of listening and not knowing what to do with it. Is thought coming up, reaction, labeling? To listen to that too, like to the bird. It's possible for thought to be there and not be caught up in it. For a word to come up and not to immediately caught in the web of associations. It's possible. Usually there's caught upness in the web of associations, reactions. And can that be seen? One has lived through it so many times and only becomes aware of it later as a memory. But can one see it as it happens, for a moment? For a moment of listening to the birds, or whatever is going on. Breath, heartbeat, traffic, these are words, but there's something beside the words going on, isn't there? Let's listen. We don't have to know what it is. There's a compulsion, deeply conditioned compulsion, to have to know what is going on, to be on top of it, as we say, through knowledge, through words, to see that urge, to feel it, and not having to go with it. It's all right to listen to movements, blowing noses, car noises, birds twittering, words and heartbeat. See, for talking with each other, we have to use words, but we don't have to be caught up in them. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be caught up in them, because if we're caught up in them, that's what's happening this moment, and awareness can reveal that. Caught upness in a word, in a reaction. And we don't have to do anything about it. We don't have to. If a reaction happens to a reaction, well, that happened. But there doesn't have to be a further reaction in that chain. It can just be listening without knowing what to do next. Can there be listening without knowing what to do next, not knowing what's going to follow? Just listening to what's there, not even knowing that. This does not need an intention, a resolution, a practice, an effort. It's just listening. This organism is equipped to listen openly. It's also equipped to think about everything that's heard and make stories out of it and react to the stories and live in stories rather than in open, simple listening, looking, with which we're not saying that there's no usefulness in writing a story or thinking about something. It has its function, but it has a limited function. And can one understand deeply the limitations of thinking about something? Or discern the difference between thinking about birds and hearing whatever is there, or seeing them hop around. Why it is so difficult to stay with this moment, well, we could now go into all kinds of explanations, but that would be not actual, it would be theoretical. Although one may have observed oneself the addictive quality of thinking about something, or pleasures or fears, feel the addictive pleasures of thinking of past pleasurable moments. And likewise the addictive quality of imagining horrendous specters to happen to one in the future. Worrying about one's future life, one's future security, one's future taken care ofness. There's just as addictive a quality in worrying about the future than in imagining pleasant things from the past, projecting them into the future. We are habitual creatures, in a way, not completely. It's also possible to look and act out of no habit, not that the heart stops beating and miracles happen or so. But even physically, so-called miracles happen. Something that was not predicted. A remission of symptoms does happen to people. So not to be totally convinced of the irreversibleness of past habits, past addictions, which is what we run on most of the time. But we're wondering about it too. And can that remain fresh, this wondering, not just become a habitual practice? I ought to be wondering, so I ought to question, who am I, who am I, who am I? But wondering freshly as attention sheds light on having been caught up in the same thought train maybe for the 100th time this day. Wondering about it and feeling it out. What is going on here? Like often waking up from a dream, when if it particularly was a pleasant dream, one doesn't want to wake up. One wants to go on dreaming and have some more of this good feeling. To notice that, then one doesn't have to theorize about why it is difficult. One can tell how one is holding on to the taste of pleasure, the taste of comfort, as the taste of good food. One person once told me this: I overeat not because I really want more food. I don't want to let go of the taste of it in my mouth. Notice something. If one notices something, one can wonder about it some more. does it have to continue like this? Not it should stop. And we don't find out anything. We just impose conditioning on top of conditioning. So let's keep that question alive. Why is it so difficult to stay with this moment? Not I should stay with this moment or I shouldn't be inattentive, but wondering from every fiber of one's body about this amazing phenomenon of living in a live world, most of the time caught up in thoughts about it. And noting how thoughts can indeed elicit live feelings. And because of that capacity of thoughts to elicit live feelings, validity is given to those thoughts as real. One person told me, waking up from a dream, and it was a nightmare, it was not a pleasant dream, and still lying in bed for quite a length of time, not realizing that this is a dream. It was so real. And this is the very nature of our thoughts, to masquerade for reality. The thought of being an independent, separate entity is a thought, a cluster of thoughts. It's not true, it's not a reality that this body is separate. That's a reality. But the idea of myself, my psychological self, and past, present, future, that's thought. Validated from moment to moment by the feelings that these thoughts about myself elicit, trigger and elicit. It must be real because I feel something in my guts, we say, or in my heart. Therefore, what I think about must be real. Is one really, truly, deeply interested in what goes on in this human being, who stands for all human beings, because these processes are not different for other human beings of other races, times, continents, and whatever. Is one interested? Or does one just want to attain a state of no problems, of bliss, freedom? Hoping to leap into that state beyond comprehending the state in which we live most of the time. I think most of the people here have worked on attaining experiences and states, maybe are involved in that yet still. We're not condemning it. One has to find out about this firsthand, that it is indeed possible to attain states and experiences. But if the listening is subtle, the inner perception is sensitive, one will find that there is some thought trying to keep this edifice going, keeping the state going, the state of no thought or emptiness. It was amazing. In the last retreat, 3 people, through talking about this in groups and talks and alone, looking at it, 3 people reported finding that they have developed this capacity to create a state of near emptiness, almost emptiness for themselves, and yet a thought underneath trying to maintain that. And someone who's doing it and enjoying it, or trembling for this to maybe be disturbed by somebody sitting next to one breathing loudly or chewing celery noisily. So much has been made particularly in the Eastern spiritual traditions, of the state of emptiness, nothingness, nirvana, bliss, undividedness, wholeness. And so many paths to it offered, so many techniques to attain it, that the temptation is immense to try to do that, to get there, to have that. The state to end all problematic states. And in this endeavor to get someplace and to practice, to create it, maybe in the success or progress in creating thoughtless, empty states, nothing is understood, or very little, about the problem states that we live in with each other most of the time. How are they created? How do they come into being? How are they maintained? What is operating? And to allow the energy gathering in such a question and looking as something is happening. A moment of attention, shedding light on what just went on. Subtly holding on to something, fear of losing it, and oblivious of the doer, the duality, and again the separation from each other, the non-comprehension of each other's problems, how they come into being. Is it difficult to listen for a moment? And again for a moment. Aware of maybe thoughts coming up, thoughts that were there, thoughts that they are now, are there. Is that sound of a bird, is that a thought? Let's listen. we will end here for today.